January 17, 1943, Schweinfurt, Bavaria. 2:47 a.m. The night air hung thick with winter fog over the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Inside the Reich Air Defense Command bunker, Oberst Heinrich Wegener stood before a plotting table, his fingers tracing the glowing points of light that materialized on the cathode ray screen like malevolent stars. Each blip represented what should have been impossible: American heavy bombers flying in precise formation, 17,000 feet above the cloud-covered darkness, moving with the certainty of daylight navigation toward the ball-bearing factories that kept the Wehrmacht's machinery turning. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and electrical ozone. The hum of the radar equipment filled the silence between radio reports. Wegener had fought in the last war, had watched his comrades fall in muddy trenches, had celebrated the Reich's rebirth with the conviction that German engineering, German discipline, German vision would prove superior to any force on earth. Now he watched those glowing points advance across his screen with mathematical precision and felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest, the first cold whisper of technological obsolescence. The war had taught the Luftwaffe many lessons, most of them written in blood and burning aluminum across the European sky. German fighter pilots had learned to respect the American B-17 Flying Fortress, with its bristling defensive armament and ability to absorb punishment that would shatter lesser aircraft. They had adapted to the daylight bombing campaigns, developing tactics to exploit the gaps in fighter escort range, to attack from the sun, to concentrate fire on specific sections of the bomber formations. But this was different. This was not the expected progression of tactical adaptation. This was something that violated the fundamental assumptions upon which the Luftwaffe had built its defensive doctrine. The Americans were bombing at night, not with the scattered inaccuracy of nuisance raids, but with the precision that German intelligence had insisted was impossible without visual contact with the target. The plotting officer called out coordinates in a steady voice, but Wegener heard the undertone of disbelief. These were not random formations wandering through the darkness, hoping to stumble across industrial targets. These were bomber streams following calculated approach vectors, maintaining altitude and airspeed with uncanny consistency, converging on objectives they could not possibly see. The concept of radar was not unfamiliar to German military planners. The Reich had developed its own radar systems, the Freya and Würzburg installations that studied the Atlantic Wall and ringed Germany's cities, providing early warning of approaching enemy formations. These were formidable instruments, products of German scientific excellence, and they had proven invaluable in coordinating fighter interceptions during daylight raids. What disturbed Wegener and his fellow officers was not the existence of radar, but its application. American bombers were carrying radar equipment aloft, using it not merely for navigation or threat detection, but for targeting. The H-2X radar system, which Allied intelligence documents later revealed, allowed bombardiers to identify terrain features, urban concentrations, and industrial complexes through complete cloud cover, through darkness, through weather conditions that would have grounded every bomber in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. The Americans had miniaturized their radar technology, refined its resolution, integrated it into the Norden bomb site's already legendary precision. They had taken a defensive tool and transformed it into an offensive weapon that rendered Germany's natural defenses, weather, darkness, distance, effectively meaningless. German military doctrine had been built on certain assumptions about technological parity. The panzer divisions had rolled across Europe in 1940 with the confidence that German armor, German combined arms tactics, and German operational planning represented the apex of military science. The Luftwaffe had terrorized Rotterdam and Warsaw, had fought the RAF to a standstill over Britain, had projected power across a continent with the assurance that no enemy could match the Luftwaffe's training, its tactical flexibility, its combat experience. Even as the tide began to turn at Stalingrad, at El Alamein, in the skies over Hamburg, German officers consoled themselves with the belief that they were being overwhelmed by numbers, not by superior technology or innovation. The Americans might produce more tanks, more aircraft, more of everything, but German engineering remained supreme. Each Panzer was worth 3 Shermans. Each Messerschmitt was flown by pilots who understood the warrior's art in ways that American farm boys never could. Quantity might prevail over quality in the brutal arithmetic of attrition, but it was a numerical defeat, not an intellectual or technological one. The American radar-equipped night bombers shattered that consoling fiction. Wegener had read the intelligence reports from captured American airmen. The interrogators at Dulag Luft were thorough, and even when the prisoners refused to provide tactical information, their casual comments revealed a disturbing picture. These men spoke of radar systems the way German soldiers spoke of compasses, as routine equipment, standard issue, nothing remarkable. They described training programs where entire crews learned to interpret radar returns, to distinguish rivers from roads, forests from farmland, on screens that reduced the landscape to ghostly green patterns. They mentioned backup systems, redundant equipment, maintenance schedules that assumed replacement rather than repair. The scale of production, the casual abundance, the systematic integration of advanced technology into standard operational procedure. These things suggested an industrial and scientific infrastructure that operated on fundamentally different assumptions than the Reich's carefully husbanded resources. Germany built radar installations as major defensive assets, positioned them strategically, defended them jealously. America built radar sets small enough to fit in a bomber's nose and mass-produced them like automobile parts. The night bombing raids intensified through the winter of 1943. Schweinfurt, Hamburg, Berlin, the Ruhr Valley, targets that should have been safely shrouded in winter darkness, received precision bombardment that German post-raid analysis confirmed was hitting industrial objectives with disturbing accuracy. The flak batteries fired blindly into the darkness, their searchlights diffused by cloud cover, their acoustic detection equipment overwhelmed by the thunder of hundreds of radial engines. Night fighters scrambled, guided by ground control radar to intercept points, but the Americans flew in combat box formations that provided mutual defensive fire even in total darkness, and the fighters found themselves engaging an enemy that somehow maintained formation integrity without visual reference to neighboring aircraft. The bomber streams flowed through the night sky like rivers following invisible channels, and German defenders who had grown accustomed to the predictable patterns of RAF night bombing scattered individual aircraft, each navigator relying on dead reckoning and celestial navigation, faced instead a coordinated assault that combined the mass formations of daylight raids with the protective cover of darkness. In officers' clubs and command bunkers across Germany, the conversations turned grim. Veteran pilots who had flown against the French, against the British, against the Russians, found themselves describing the American bomber formations with a mixture of professional respect and ideological confusion. These were not the warriors of tradition, not men who tested their courage in individual combat or proved their skill through superior pilotship. These were technicians operating machinery, following instrument readings, executing predetermined flight plans calculated by specialists on the ground. There was no artistry in it, no expression of national character or martial virtue. It was industrial, mechanistic, deeply antithetical to the German conception of warfare as an arena for demonstrating superiority of will and spirit, and it was devastatingly effective. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, which German planners had believed to be essentially invulnerable to night attack, suffered production losses that rippled through the entire military manufacturing infrastructure. The synthetic oil refineries, dispersed and camouflaged precisely to frustrate precision bombing, received direct hits from bombardiers who never saw the targets with their own eyes. The captured documents told their own story. American technical manuals described radar systems with a clarity and detail that suggested no fear of technological espionage, no concern that enemies might replicate the technology. The confidence was almost insulting. These manuals read as though written for students, complete with troubleshooting guides and simplified explanations of complex electromagnetic principles. German engineers who examined salvaged radar equipment from crashed American bombers reported a combination of sophisticated design and standardized manufacturing that suggested these devices were being produced in quantities that defied belief. The modularity, the interchangeable components, the design philosophy that emphasized field replacement over specialized repair, these were the hallmarks of an industrial system operating with resources so abundant that equipment could be treated as expendable. In the Reich, where every strategic material was carefully allocated, where synthetic substitutes replaced unavailable resources, where craftsmen rebuilt damaged equipment because replacement was impossible, this American approach to technology represented not merely a different tactical doctrine, but a fundamentally different relationship to material reality. Wegener thought about the symbolic weight of that radar screen, glowing softly in the darkness of the bunker. It was, in its way, a perfect representation of the American approach to warfare. Not the individual heroism of the pilot testing his skill against an enemy in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat, but the systematic application of technological advantage, the replacement of human limitation with electronic capability, the transformation of warfare from a test of national character into a problem of industrial production and scientific innovation. The radar allowed American bombers to ignore weather, to ignore darkness, to ignore the natural defenses that had protected German cities for centuries. It reduced the romance of aerial combat to geometry and electromagnetic radiation. And it worked. That was the disturbing truth that Wegener and his colleagues confronted in those winter months. It worked not occasionally, not as a specialized tactic deployed by elite units, but consistently, reliably, as standard operational procedure executed by average crews flying average missions. The psychological impact rippled through the German military establishment. Officers who had built their careers on the assumption of German technological superiority found themselves confronting evidence that America had not merely matched German innovation, but had surpassed it in specific, crucial areas. The Reich scientists could explain the principles of radar, could design sophisticated systems, could theorize improvements and refinements, but they could not produce these systems in the quantities required, could not miniaturize them sufficiently for airborne use, could not integrate them into operational doctrine with the speed and efficiency that characterized American military adaptation. The gap was not merely technological but systemic. It reflected different industrial capabilities, different research and development infrastructures, different relationships between military need and civilian manufacturing capacity. Germany was a fortress, carefully marshalling its resources, desperately trying to maintain production levels against strategic bombing and raw material shortages. America was an arsenal, producing with such abundance that equipment could be redesigned mid-war, production lines retooled, new technologies introduced without disrupting overall output. The reports from the Eastern Front added another dimension to the growing unease. Soviet forces were increasingly equipped with American radar equipment delivered through Lend-Lease, integrated into their air defense networks. The same technological advantage that made American night bombing so effective was being extended to allies, shared with the systematic generosity that characterized American material support. German intelligence documented not only the transfer of finished equipment, but also the training programs, the technical manuals, the spare parts logistics that ensured Soviet operators could maintain and effectively employ these systems. This was not the hoarding of technological secrets that characterized German, British, or Soviet practices, but a confidence so profound that America seemed unconcerned about proliferating its most advanced military technology. The implications were deeply troubling from an ideological perspective. The National Socialist worldview held that technological advancement was the product of superior racial character, that German achievement reflected inherent German superiority. Yet here were American systems operated effectively by Soviet crews, by British crews, by crews from nations that German ideology dismissed as racially inferior. The technology worked regardless of who operated it, suggesting that its effectiveness derived not from the character of its users, but from the quality of its design and the industrial capacity that produced it. By spring of 1944, the pattern was undeniable. American bomber formations flew with increasing impunity, striking targets throughout Germany with accuracy that weather conditions should have made impossible. The Luftwaffe adapted as best it could, developing new night fighter tactics, concentrating anti-aircraft defenses, attempting to disrupt the bomber streams before they reached their targets. But every adaptation was reactive, a response to American initiative, an attempt to counter American technological advantage with German tactical flexibility. The strategic initiative had shifted fundamentally. Germany defended, reacted, attempted to minimize damage. America attacked, innovated, expanded the scope of operations. The radar-equipped bombers were merely one manifestation of a larger pattern. The proximity fuse that made anti-aircraft fire devastatingly effective. The long-range fighter escorts that accompanied bombers to Berlin and back. The strategic intelligence that identified bottlenecks in German production and targeted them systematically. Officers like Wegener, who had witnessed both wars, who had celebrated the Reich's victories and now managed its increasingly desperate defense, understood that they were witnessing not merely a military defeat, but a philosophical one. The ideology that had driven Germany to war rested on assumptions about national character, racial superiority, the decisive importance of will and spirit over material considerations. The Americans were proving, through the systematic application of industrial capacity and technological innovation, that material abundance could overwhelm ideological fervor, that engineering excellence deployed at scale could defeat tactical brilliance operating under resource constraints. The radar screen in the bunker, with its constellation of electronic blips representing enemy bombers operating in conditions that should have protected German targets, became a silent witness to the erosion of certainty, the slow recognition that the war was being lost, not because Germans lacked courage or skill, but because they faced an enemy organized around principles they had dismissed as decadent, inefficient, unheroic. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 combined the methodologies that German defenders had learned to dread: massive formations, precision radar navigation, complete coordination between pathfinder aircraft and main bomber streams, weather conditions that provided no protection. The firestorm that consumed the city demonstrated the ultimate refinement of capabilities that had first alarmed Oberst Wegener in January 1943. What had begun as disturbing reports of unexpectedly accurate night bombing had evolved into a systematic devastation of Germany's urban and industrial infrastructure, conducted with the mechanical efficiency that characterized American military operations. The war ended not with a climactic battle testing national wills, but with Germany's industrial capacity destroyed, its infrastructure shattered, its ability to resist systematically dismantled by an enemy that approached warfare as an engineering problem requiring systematic solution. In the ruins of the Reich, among officers awaiting interrogation and processing, the conversations returned repeatedly to technology, to industrial capacity, to the realization that they had underestimated not American courage, that had never been in question, but American approach. The radar-equipped bombers became, in retrospect, the symbol of a larger misapprehension. Germany had prepared to fight a war of movement, of tactical brilliance, of qualitative superiority compensating for quantitative disadvantage. America had fought a war of production, of technological innovation deployed at scale, of systematic destruction executed with the confidence of unlimited resources. The glowing radar screens had shown German defenders the approach of their own obsolescence, the mathematical precision of an enemy that had transformed warfare from individual contest to industrial process. And in that transformation, in that reduction of combat to coordinates and electromagnetic returns, lay a truth more disturbing than any battlefield defeat, that the future belonged not to warriors who embodied national virtues, but to technicians who mastered systematic methods, to societies that organized abundance rather than husbanding scarcity, to democracies that approached war as problem requiring solution rather than test requiring passage. The radar screen glowed in the darkness, marking targets with impersonal precision, and the officers who watched understood they were witnessing not merely enemy aircraft, but the future itself, arriving with the inexorable certainty of electromagnetic radiation propagating through the night.